How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to WWII Hobby Time. I assembled this box of Soviet soldiers from World War II for a previous project, and I had 5 leftovers, and they were burning a hole on my shelf. So I decided today was finally the day to use them. The prompt that I'll be following for this project is a day at the lake. So here's the plan. These 5 soldiers are wading through a shallow lake, when all of a sudden they find themselves surrounded by something unknown in the water. And the enemy in question is large and coiled all around them. The first step in bringing this diorama to life is to form the lake bed, and for that I'll be using Sculpt-a-Mold. I used very little water this time, so the Sculpt-a-Mold would dry sooner and not push back my resin curing time, which does have its drawbacks though, one of which is the working time is only a matter of minutes. After the Sculpt-a-Mold had been moistened and kneaded, I smeared it over the surface of the gesso board, making sure to maintain a nice uneven consistency. After the mold had been sculpted, I smoothed out the surface with the help of some isopropyl alcohol, just to make sure I got rid of all of those sharp angles. I cleaned up those sides, and I was ready to move on to the monster. And to make today's monster, I'll be using some pale flesh Super Sculpey. My somewhat misguided intention was to only show parts of the monster and not necessarily let on what it was, boosting the immersion and helping the viewer understand the sensation of terror that the soldiers would be feeling. I used some mesh material to give the clay some scales, implying that maybe it was a snake, but those scales are not visible at all. I should really get my hands on a thicker mesh. I then sliced the snake into 4 parts and put them in the corners like it was weaving its way in and out of the mud around the soldiers. As I was working on this, I realized it's very similar to another diorama that I did not too long ago, and I really wasn't feeling the layout of this one. So I began considering other options for creatures that you wouldn't want to run into while spending time at the lake. And instead of having one large creature circling around them, I decided, why not turn each of these segments into a leech? Along with the 4 large sections that I reshaped and pointed inward, I made additional worms of various sizes, which I oriented around the center like a star. Large, wiggly, parasitic star. I don't know about you, but I feel far more uncomfortable about this layout than just one snake wrapped around the whole thing. The clay obviously needs to harden, and I'll be baking it in a second, but to begin with, I gave it some heat from the heat gun. Now that I'm looking at this, I actually have no idea why I did that, because I could have just baked it from the get-go. And it wouldn't have made much of a difference, but yeah, that's cool. After 20 minutes in the oven, it was nice and hard and ready for the next step. I grabbed a bag of medium green from lichen. I felt like some realistic plant life under the surface would add to the lake-likeness of the water. I quickly realized that I liked the medium green color and didn't want to have to paint over it, so I took that off and I brought the base outside to prime. I primed it with a matte black primer, and while I was at it, I primed my unfortunate Soviet soldiers as well. And while I paint this thing, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. As is the case with all the dioramas that I make that involve an adaptation of a real-life animal, I like to do research and find out interesting things about said animals. In this case, I learned many interesting facts about leeches, all of which reinforced my pre-existing negative biases toward leeches. Leeches come in many shapes and sizes and colors. I decided to go with black because the dark slithering shapes in the water would be scarier without markings, at least in my opinion. Additionally, the tinting of the water is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the spooky effect on this one. And speaking of spooky, among creatures that bite and suck blood, leeches are actually relatively safe. Little ones, that is. Still, the idea of a segmented worm with multiple sets of jaws and saliva that keeps your blood from clotting is a pretty nasty thought. But not all leeches are parasitic. So you could have been looking at this diorama and thinking, hey, extra large leeches wouldn't go after humans, because humans wouldn't have the flesh real estate for them to be enticing. And maybe that would be true if these leeches were parasitic, but predatory leeches exist as well, unfortunately. And they engulf and swallow their prey whole. I saw it on Peter Jackson's King Kong. Let's be real though, no matter how we peel this, no matter what type of leech it was, it would be an awful sensation, an awful sight to be surrounded by blood-hungry, heat-seeking, segmented worms. With that, the paint job on the soldiers was done, and it was time to put them in place. While I was removing them from their painting handle, one fell on the floor and lost his head. I was able to find it after a few minutes and glue it back in place. With all the soldiers accounted for and in one piece, I was able to figure out the positioning on the base that made sense and began gluing. After the guys were in their spots, it was time to build a dam to hold back the resin. I grabbed a piece of acrylic, I measured that out, and scored it thoroughly with a plastic scriber. Once I have a nice deep line, I should be able to snap it cleanly along that line with very little effort. So instead of following the nice clean line that I had scribed, the acrylic decided to do its own thing, making this piece unusable. And rather than slice up more acrylic, I decided to go with tape again, like last time. It's not the most reliable method, nor do the sides turn out perfect, but that's okay. It worked out for me last time, so decided to do it again. To ensure that it was watertight, I put a bead of hot glue around the base, which I flattened out with the side of the nozzle. And the reason I'm okay with tape is that the pour is shallow enough that even the inconsistencies won't be that obvious. I was going to mix up the resin at this point, but I realized my medium green was still wet, and water and resin don't mix well. They mix poorly, in fact, so I waited for that to dry overnight. The next morning I came back to it, and the grass was dry and ready to be submerged in lake water. Speaking of lake water, I didn't really grow up doing lake days or spending much time in lakes in general. I didn't really think of them as a place to swim. As a result, I think my impression of lakes and lake water comes across in the coloration that I chose for this water here. Obviously, I know not all lakes and their water is nasty. I've seen very many beautiful lakes myself, but I figured a lake with a bunch of giant leeches should be on the murkier side. Or at least murkier water combined with the leeches would add to the disturbing nature of the diorama. Once mixed, I gently poured the resin into the mold and popped the bubbles with isopropyl alcohol, which relieves the surface tension. I also used a butane torch, but not at the same time as the isopropyl alcohol. That's very important. And I tended to the surface for 30 minutes, and then I left it to cure. This particular resin took only 24 hours to cure, and it was ready to be demolded. I used isopropyl alcohol to assist in removing the hot glue layer, and then I peeled off the tape, which gave me a little bit of trouble, but I was able to use a tip that I learned from Chuck McGill. Next, I shaved the sharp edge off the rim of the resin and threw some agitated water surfacing around the humans, which I spread around with an airbrush, which should hopefully give the impression that it's being splashed around by the people, of the people, and for the people. For the rest of the water surface, I used water ripples from Woodland Scenics, which I spritzed with more IPA to help give it a more gentle look. The last thing to do was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0. And after that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to enjoy this collection of Day at the Lake submissions sent in by my patrons for the monthly art challenge. Excellent job, and thank you to all the patrons who participated last month. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.